Thank you for joining the National Press Foundation briefing, How Inequality Affects Families Across Generations, coming to you from our Evelyn Y studio in Washington, D.C. The effects of poverty on mental and physical health are well known, but how do those consequences show up from one generation to the next? I'm Godlasky, NPF's Director of Journalism Training, and I'm excited to tackle that question today with all of you and our panel of experts. This is just the latest in a series of webinars on poverty, and for that, we'd like to thank our sponsors, the David and Lucille Packard Foundation, the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, and the Heising-Simons Foundation. For more tips on poverty reporting, please see the link in the chat. I'd like to introduce our speakers for today. Dr. Tracy Bale is a neuroscientist and director of the Center for Epigenetic Research in Child Health and Brain Development at the University of Maryland Medical School. Dr. Sierra Carter is director of the Heart Lab, Health Equity, Agency, Racism, and Trauma, and a faculty member on psychology and behavioral sciences at Georgia State University and Emory University School of Medicine. Pam Fessler is an author after a nearly 50-year career in journalism, 3 decades of that at NPR and 13 years of that reporting on poverty. Thank you all for being here today. And to our audience, please send in questions as you have them, either by raising your Zoom hand or asking via the Q&A along the bottom of your screens. As always, we are on the record here and we'll be posting a transcript and video on nationalpress.org after this session. To kick us off, I wanted to talk about a word that has entered the popular lexicon, epigenetics. From Twitter to TikTok, videos on this topic are racking up millions of likes. But my understanding is that these social media creators talk about epigenetics in a way that is very different from the way scientists do. And even among scientists, there are very different uses of that term. Dr. Bale, could you tell us what epigenetics means as someone who studies it?
I would be happy to. I think it's best done, though. I'm going to share my screen if that's okay. And walk through a couple of slides, and I think that will maybe help with questions that will pop up on our term of epigenetics. So, as a neuroscientist, as Anne highlighted at the university here, I do both basic research and translational research, as well as community engagement. And one of the things that my lab is particularly interested in is understanding vulnerable populations. And how do we understand the science behind who is vulnerable, and ultimately interested in understanding the child's brain and how that environment may affect the ultimate presentation of the child's brain. So why do we are interested in this? Adverse childhood events, as something that Anne just mentioned, are those experiences, or could be traumatic experiences, are highly associated with health outcomes. We know that from poverty studies. Those ACEs in currently pregnant women across the United States, shown here, as distributed, if you've had 0 ACEs as a child, 1, 2, 3, or 4 or more. We know that from the Kaiser Permanente studies, that 4 or more experiences of these adverse childhood events during your childhood, so let's say you're now pregnant, that is sort of the cutoff for where significant health consequences can be happening to mom, and then of course be passed on or affect the health outcomes of the developing child. So I live in the city of Baltimore. As part of my recruitment here to start this center was to focus on the vulnerable populations within the city of Baltimore, as shown here from the Henrietta Lacks news report from, I think, back in October of 2021. We all know the story behind the discrimination and trauma that Baltimore has faced for across generations, relevant to today's topic. Now, if you would imagine in the city of Baltimore, the majority Black city facing decades and generations of discrimination and trauma, of currently pregnant women in this city, how many would you expect, or what percentage of those that have had 4 or more ACEs? Well, it turns out the study done here at the university shows that it's over 60%. And that is a significant issue of concern for both mom's health and, of course, baby outcomes as well. So understanding this concept we're here to talk about today, how does this child's brain, by the time you're born, has been affected by, no doubt, everything in mom's environment? So it's a complicated question. What has mom been exposed to during pregnancy, further traumas and stresses, et cetera? Mom's biological environment, meaning her uterus, all the things that she was exposed to since she was born. My lab spends a lot of time thinking over on the right side here about these things called germ cells coming from mom on the top, dad on the bottom, and how they come together at conception. And that really is the term that we're talking about today, Anne, and thinking about the term epigenetics and what does that mean as it gives rise to all the consequential events leading up to the child's brain. So my lab is interested in a translational approach. We do things in cell culture. We look at signals that may be important for the brain. We model these in mice. Yes, these are mammals. We study large numbers of mice actually in our lab. And that's because we can limit the exposures. Humans are very messy. And subjective recall of things you've experienced is also makes it very complicated. We control the environment. When mom's pregnant, she has a litter. She has both males and females in that litter. We can really isolate the environment that they're exposed to. High fat diet, stress, etc. And then we have these things called transgenes. Again, thinking about the genetics as they intersect with the environment. We can do all of those things. And then we take all of that information and we apply it to translational human studies. This is actually a study that Dr. Carter and I were involved in that came out last year, where we're able to assess some of those things that we found in our animal studies and in cell culture and ask about the continuity in humans, and then go back into the mice and ask more specific questions. Okay, so what specifically, Anne, are epigenetics? So the term really refers to biochemical modifications that alter how our genes are expressed in every cell. So those could be cells relevant to germ cells, and those could be cells relevant to how you're sitting here right now and the genes that are being turned on in your brain, right? All of them require epigenetics. It's not something that you only have when something bad happens. Epigenetics are present in all our cells all the time. They don't change the DNA sequence, but they're biochemical modifications that change how the genes themselves can be expressed. And simply put, in this schematic here, those include things like DNA methylation that you hear about all the time. So those are just methyl groups, biochemical modifications on top of our DNA. Those include things like imprinted genes, and those are things that can be altered by the environment, but are not always inherited. And we'll come back to that. There are histone modifications, that next designation. So you know, if you remember from your high school days, if you haven't finished up in science, is that your DNA is wrapped around histones, and how your DNA gets expressed in addition to that methylation are those modifications on what are called histone tails, how your DNA is wrapped. And there's things that are called acetylation and methylation, all kinds of biochemical marks that tell which genes to be expressed when. Both methylation and histone modifications are present in all of our cells all of the time, and they can be influenced by the environment. One other modification called small non-coding RNAs, and those can include, as I'm showing you here, what are called microRNA. Those can also affect how genes are expressed, although they're not biochemical on DNA itself. All of these together, Anne, are called epigenetics. They're in our cells all the time, normal processing, but they can absolutely be affected, the levels of them and the types of them, by our environment. But now the question becomes, can they be inherited? And that's really the course of discussion that we can have once we've defined what they are. Can they be found in germ cells? And can they be inherited if altered by the environment?
Thank you, Dr. Bale. This is really fascinating. And I do want to get back to that point that you ended on. But first, I'd like to skip over to Dr. Carter. Dr. Carter, that kind of leads me into this idea of intergenerational trauma, because again, on these social media platforms, you see that used almost interchangeably when people are talking about epigenetics and ancestral trauma, intergenerational trauma, this idea that these things are passed down. As a psychologist, as someone who really, studies, not just individuals, but family dynamics, can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, of course. And I think it's such a good question, because there are so many terms that people use around intergenerational trauma, ancestral history, historical trauma. And I think a lot of it is involved in kind of a validation seeking of pain that has been passed down for generations. But at the heart of intergenerational trauma, right, is what is being passed down from those who directly experience a traumatic incident to subsequent generations at the heart of it, right? And where I began to learn a lot about intergenerational trauma actually happened when I going to conferences on trauma around the Holocaust, right? That was when we started having discussions around people who were survived the Holocaust and what happened generations later around traumatic symptoms across generations. And that, I think, was a push for this conversation around, can trauma be passed down to influence PTSD symptoms or post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms? And like Dr. Bale was saying, humans are messy, right? And how they experience, how they thrive under stress environments. And so it begins to have a question where we were seeing amongst people who had generations after the Holocaust of people who were more prone, a part of that generation, to experience PTSD symptoms. And I began to question about how the person who experienced this really traumatic stressor, could some of those components be passed down across generations and across time to where there's more elevated symptoms of not only post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms and offspring, but also things like anxiety or depression or things that are linked to that. So as a clinical psychologist, I think when listening to people's stories about, like, my mom experienced a lot of traumatic incidents and it influenced the way she talked to me about things like sexual assault and what is going to be experienced, like not only within the genes, but also in how we learn and how we process and how we learn from our family members. That kind of stuff, I think, is an important consideration of thinking about this term intergenerational trauma, of what gets passed down from someone who experienced a specific incident across time. And that leads me to thinking about, particularly I study a lot with Black Americans who've experienced a lot of injustice. So specific incidents like enslavement, for example, what are things that could be passed down, not only genetically, but also through learned processes around how to survive in oppressive environments? How does that get passed down, if it does or if it does not, and ways that people have learned to survive these types of stressors?
Yeah, that's fascinating. As both of you said, humans are messy. And so everything's so intertwined in terms of, not just the genetics, but the social aspects of it as well. Pam, coming to you, let's put all of the genetics and science aside for a second and talk about what you have seen and reported on, in real life. How have you kind of reported on families in a way that that kind of shows the impact that things like poverty can have over the course of a lifetime or over the course of several generations?
Yeah, thank you, Anne. First of all, this is really fascinating. I must admit, after covering poverty for, I guess it was about 10, 15 years, this is the first I heard of epigenetics. So that just only illustrates why such panels are so important. Most journalists, obviously, when we're covering poverty, what we have to do is, you have to cover it through people, right? You have to cover it by describing what people are going through. So most journalists will find a family or two who seem to illustrate the topic that you're covering, whether it's evictions, whether it's the challenges of a single mother with children trying to survive in this particular economy. The problem, of course, is no family is totally representative of everything, right? Nobody is the typical family. So you have to come at it with, some kind of qualifications. And I think that's important when you are covering poverty. But again, you come to it where you have to make the story real for the listeners and their viewers. And the reason we're even doing it is we want, obviously, our audience to know what people in this country are experiencing, which they might not know themselves, but also what we do as a society to deal with these problems, how maybe we can resolve and help families who are struggling with poverty. Or what types of social policy or public policy should be adopted. And it's interesting because when I'm covering it usually from what's actually happening to them and what I see happening to them, and see what, their children, not the medical or the scientific things that are going on. And that's why this is so fascinating and so important to know, because of course that informs what we as a society do in addressing poverty. I can tell you, every time I have covered a family that's experiencing poverty, I will try and spend a lot of time with them, because I feel like it's really important that I can't just parachute in, that I have to spend days with them. And so, often I would try to always go into a person's home if I could, because I would get a better sense. And invariably, you just saw the impact that it was having generationally, that you could see the children who were struggling because their parents were struggling. And often when I would talk to the parents, they would talk about the things that they had gone through as children. And we just basically describe it as the cycle of poverty, but it sounds like there's a lot more going on than just the social effects of poverty. And that's why I think this discussion is so fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good point. And that kind of leads me into going back a bit, actually, to what Dr. Bale was talking about with ACEs. So we know that that low income or economic stress for the parents, or housing instability, which also is obviously related to poverty, that those are all risk factors for ACEs. Dr. Carter, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what is the difference between, a stressor and a trauma, and does it even matter, in this discussion?
It does, is a short answer. And the way that we as clinicians think about diagnoses and treatment in our current diagnostic manual. So, and a lot of stressors, and I will preface this by saying our diagnostic manuals have changed over time, right? To acknowledge what things can be considered traumatic. But in our current discussion of trauma versus stress, there are a number of lifetime stressors that we don't think are considered traumatic in the ways that it can lead to diagnoses for PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. So that can include things like job loss. You can think about things that are stressful: job loss, the death of a loved one due to natural causes, right? Those are really stressful incidents, but would not necessarily fall under what we would consider to be traumatic. And those things include things that include life threats. So threats to your life, threats of death, threats of harm, sexual assault. And that includes also things like natural disasters that you've experienced, witnessed, or heard about. So it includes a number of ways of thinking about how things can be traumatic, but this has been over a course of time of thinking about research around things that are linked to things that don't lead to a normal recovery, in the sense of how these stressors work out. And so a lot of times when we think about things that are really stressful, we want to say it's traumatic, but in a scientific, but also clinical frame, a lot of the stressors that we experience are stressful. We can name it as stressful experiences, but traumatic is a specific area that I think is tricky, because I study racism and I also think racism is traumatic, right? And I also think in ways poverty is traumatic, but as the research grows into how that influences diagnoses, as well as how we think about treatment, we haven't in ways defined certain things as traumatic in the ways that people are reporting it. So I will say, I think we are behind the game, and some stressors that we think should be included. And that includes things like COVID-19 stress, right? There is some work that is saying, hey, this should be considered under the traumatic experiences literature, but we need the evidence to support that of how it looks when people are presenting with symptoms, how people recover. And we don't necessarily have enough research aligning, because obviously, although we think COVID-19 has been going on for a long time, we don't have as much background to say that it fits in our nomenclature around traumatic stressors that we have currently diagnostically.
That is really helpful. And I think also for all the journalists on the call, because sometimes when something enters the lexicon and it's just used so much, it can be really easy to start to use that without maybe thinking about the medical and the scientific meaning behind it. So definitely good to be careful there. We do have a question from Dawn in the chat. She asks, do we know how adoption plays a role? She says, I believe I've seen research that look at the outcome on the individual that was birthed out of a traumatic experience, but raised in a life free of trauma, as opposed to what, the surrogate experienced. Do you still see hereditary expressions? Or is it more a combination of genetics and environment as opposed to one over the other? Dr. Bale, I think I'm going to come back to you on this.
I actually, Anne, happen to have a slide that will
I thought you might. It's like Dawn set us up. Thank you, Dawn.
So if you think about what Dr. Carter was discussing, so I want to highlight one thing for the press, especially when we're talking about scientific results. All of the studies that Dr. Carter was referencing are relevant for human studies, whether they be clinical studies, whether they be cohort studies, et cetera. When you want to model these sorts of things for research purposes in animal studies, there's no such thing as trauma because mice don't have the ability to perceive something that Dr. Carter was talking about, right? So that I think is a really important distinction in how we take these big publications that come out and really overstate their findings, right? Stress is a component of trauma, but you cannot take a mouse and traumatize them. You just can't. So when we think about the effects, to answer your question related to genetics and environment, all of the effects, and in fact, the New York Times just had an article yesterday. So Tom Insel, the former director of the National Institute on Mental Health, wrote a really great piece, and he has a book that addresses why we don't understand neuropsychiatric disease better and what's holding us back. So if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. So all of us, everybody on this call, your risk for neuropsychiatric disease, depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, autism, all of the neuropsychiatric areas is based on three things, really. It is your genetic risk, as seen on the right. That is looking across entire human chromosomes, looking at the studies that they've pulled out to assess risk. And I want to remind you, as Dr. Carter has highlighted, we only understand risk. This is not deterministic. When you add up all of your genetic risks inherited from mom and dad, that may only give us really a small fraction of your risk for any given disease. Why? Because the other components that we're talking about today include the environment. So that could be traumatic experience, as Dr. Carter highlighted, or poverty, as Pam Fessler highlighted. But it could be things like your diet, your mom's diet, especially while she was pregnant with you. It could be your current diet. It could be that trauma and stress we talked about. I have the microbiome on here because that's a very popular topic in the press as well. All of these things add to that genetic risk you've inherited, right? So now you have risk on top of environment. But when those things come together, so that developmental timing, we call this the G by E by D. And so all of these things come together to determine who is at the greatest risk. And that was why I was showing you earlier, those ACEs for especially our most vulnerable populations. If you add discrimination trauma over the period of generations, that adds to these other insults that will elevate your risk, as Dr. Carter said, for things like PTSD. So those are incredibly important. I'm going to skip over that because I already mentioned that and that and that. What I want to highlight to answer your question, Anne, is this piece that's so complicated, is that this intergenerational inheritance or epigenetics. And so just quickly, we all know that at conception, it's dad's sperm that comes together with mom's egg. So if we have generations of experiences that we're talking about, only those things that can reside in those cells can be really that transfer of epigenetic marks. I'm going to use mark here because it covers all of those epigenetics that I showed you. Okay, so in the case of humans, because you cannot dissociate being raised by a parent who was exposed to trauma or a grandparent that raised that parent exposed to trauma. Those are really hard things to pull apart because, of course, how we parent has a lot of effects that intersect, again, with our genetics. So at conception, you're getting mom and dad's DNA and any of those epigenetic marks that may have been changed. That's true. But what's also true is highlighted at the bottom. Once conception happens and you get the formation of an embryo, I'm just showing you on the far left here, a 2-cell embryo. What does that mean? It means it is literally 2 cells. So you can think about those marks coming together through the processes of reproductive mechanisms that happen in all mammals. Almost all of those marks that I just told you about are completely erased. There are a limited number that are retained, and those are usually around imprinted genes, and those are not what we're talking about today. However, so when you get from the 2-cell embryo to what's next here, what's called a blastocyst, now you have different cell types doing different things. They may become placenta, they may become embryo. Now we're talking about 182 cells. Right now you can imagine as you get the propagation of 2 cells into all these other cell divisions, then you end up with a fetus, right? So an embryo goes to a blastocyst, goes to a fetus. Now you have millions of cells. Through all those cell divisions, whether it's a mouse or a human, there is no known mechanism to propagate that signal. And I show you that on the bottom here. If that epigenetic mark, let's say it's a change in methylation that I told you about, there is no way for that mark to become continuous in other cells, such as the blastocyst, et cetera, et cetera. And so what happens instead, I don't know what's going on with, what happens instead is that instead of it being intergenerational epigenetics, if you think back to what Dr. Carter was saying about experiences, that at the level of A, that mark in A, that can set a cascade of events to happen that changes then how B, the blastocyst, comes to be, and C, the fetus, comes to be. It can speed up things, it can slow down things, it can change the cells as they're dividing, such that by the end, you end up with, at D here, in this case, mouse, which may in fact be slightly different enough to then alter. So I think it's safer to say, as we think about the press talking about these concepts, that it's not epigenetics continuously, but that an epigenetic process that may have happened to grandma or mom or dad results in effects. And those effects are important, and they can change how you interact with your environment. And so you are slightly different because the brain is really complicated, right? So this is how the different parts of the brain, we know that the very front of this brain here is the prefrontal cortex. It doesn't finish maturing until you're in your 20s and 30s. You continue to interact with your environment. And if those effects altered how your brain was shaped, you're going to get an intergenerational effect for sure. And that may make that next generation more vulnerable. Because you can see, if you look over at this left side, Anne, that very little changes early on in reproductive processes can result in really dramatic, differently brains at different times in environment. So if you're more sensitive and now you're a middle schooler and you're experiencing all kinds of stresses or traumas as defined by Dr. Carter, that will shape how your brain matures. And now you may be at much greater risk as you develop. And so I'm just going to end there and happy to take questions. But that Anne is really the complexity of how we think about, it's not the epigenetics that are transmitted, but the effects of those epigenetics that make you so vulnerable.
That
Can
was,
I ask, do you mind if I ask a quick question of both Dr. Bale and Dr. Carter? So if the effect of poverty on a future generation, whether it's the result of some kind of genetic change or the environment, what difference does that make? What the cause is, or how the change has been made?
That is a great question. And so I'll let Sierra answer at the level of human outcomes and treatment. I will just say, at the scientific level, for how we think about where we could intervene or where we could apply therapies or the mechanisms that are involved, that's where it matters. It doesn't matter to that child, of course, they're still going to be at risk, but we can't really understand who's at risk, where to intervene, what we might look for if we don't understand what we call mechanisms of, okay, we're not looking for those changes. What we're looking for, if I take a blood sample, Pam, from you right now and look at white blood cells, which is typically what we're looking at when people take blood from another human being, and I were to look at DNA methylation, I'm probably going to find changes. But what does that tell us if we don't understand what those changes mean? And they're not the same changes maybe that your mom had or your dad had, but in fact, maybe how you're dealing with your environment. And so it might tell us something different about therapies.
And I agree with that. I think one important note here as well is when we're thinking about mechanisms, as Dr. Bale was saying, oftentimes we don't think of things like poverty and oppression as a mechanism and how we think about things that cause inequities. And so I think the naming of what is causing these processes is important if it is a societal ill and not an individual ill. Because when we talk about the US society in particular and how we think about meritocracy and picking yourself up from your bootstraps and working hard, right? Oftentimes, you know, we have this bias to say the person is just not working hard enough, right? If they're living in poverty, if they would work harder, they could get out of their circumstances. And in some cases that is true, but we also know that there's sometimes a cost to that as well, physically. And so when we think about these processes, I think the mechanism is really important from a human perspective of being able to think about ways in which our society has to shift and not the individual, in order for substantial changes to be made, if that is the mechanism. So if poverty is what is influencing poor health outcomes, if poverty is what is influencing a number of disparities in diabetes, cardiovascular health across, you know, time, and we continue to see these disparities in maternal health inequities, then the question becomes, we need to address that. And not necessarily the individual. And so that's what I think as researchers and as a clinician and thinking about what the treatment serves, we tend to think about as an important consideration.
Yeah, I absolutely think that's a great way of putting it, Dr. Carter.
Yeah. I think you can certainly see how the kind of political and policy effects that would have. Going back just very quickly to the, you know, adoption question, you know, if the person had a loving family, right, you know, comfortable life and never met. I was wondering, Dr. Bale, if you could talk about
that's the windows. Yeah, this is the windows piece that I was talking about. And you know what, the analogy that I like to use that I think clarifies this. So you think about building a house. And if you have all the structure and framing in, and now you need to put in all the wiring, using the analogy of the wiring being like your brain. And so the walls are all open and you can put the wiring in, you can see what you're doing. But now let's think about you've finished. So somebody forgot to put the wiring in and they built your house and there's no wiring in there. You missed the window of when you were going to have well done wiring of your entire house that somebody could come in and inspect and ensure was all accurate. Now the house is all filled in, the walls are all closed up, and now you're going to go back and try and do it without making a mess, and it's not going to be done very well. And that's about those windows. So to the question about experience, and yes, and so Nathan Fox and Chuck Nelson are two people who've done so much work around this, about the Romanian orphanage studies, that if you take these kids who are, it's not the trauma that Dr. Carter's talking about, but it's more about neglect, right? They're in these orphanages, they're not getting love, there's no affection, there's no physical interaction. And so these kids are showing all kinds of deficits. If you get them out of the orphanage by the age of 2 into foster care, dramatic changes can happen in how they receive love and affection and personal interactions, right? Changing the course of their brain. If it's after 2, especially if I believe it's up to 6 or 10, that they've been in that orphanage setting, then it doesn't matter because you've missed the window. And so I think that's what those adoption studies show, is that there are some effects that, because you're going to have, again, those risks, that DNA, those risk alleles that you inherit from mom and dad. And those risk alleles can also put you at greater risk of poverty, going back to what Pam was saying about the cycle. And so if you inherit risk alleles that make you not interact in your environment well, you're more likely to end up in poverty. And then of course your kids are going to inherit that DNA. And then if they have compounding, right, so you can see that cycle. If you get out of that environment, you're adopted, you still have those risk alleles. And so you may or may not be able to change the course of that. It's not, again, that it's the deterministic, but it's the DNA by environment, by those windows. And we have to be mindful. I think that answers Pam's question again about why does it matter that because we do need to know those windows of when and who.
Mm-hmm. We have a question from a journalist in Uganda who is asking if contraceptives can affect epigenetics.
So I'll just jump in here. I don't know if Siri want to add on that, but contraceptives in the case of affecting gonadal hormones, right? That's what contraceptives typically, I'm not sure which ones that are being referred to here, but there's a lot of information actually about effects of changing gonadal hormones via women who have experienced changes in gonadal hormones during pregnancy. So going back generations when women were given all kinds of crazy pharmaceuticals so that they wouldn't be nauseous. Those are really interesting studies. And that whether those could have actually changed epigenetics such that baby didn't show effects. This is related to the autism studies, but actually their grandchildren were showing the effects and that would be really one of the first cases of trying to understand epigenetics. But that again occurred during pregnancy itself. If you're actually just talking about just taking contraceptives in the way of preventing pregnancy, to my knowledge, there's not any great evidence on epigenetic changes now.
Interesting. Pam, I'm going to come back to you a second. Actually, off of the question that you asked, I'm curious, certainly the science is incredibly interesting, but there's a certain amount of, good journalism practices when you're covering poverty that are going to be the same regardless of whether the science side of it enters the story or not. From your 10-15 years of covering poverty, what are the most important lessons that you learned, especially about building trust with your sources?
Well, a couple of things that I mentioned already, that you don't go into it looking at anybody as totally representative of poor people, that like everything else that we're talking about a broad range of people. There are people in this country who become poor for brief periods of time. They go in and out of poverty. We have people who are basically stuck in poverty for generations. And you have people who, some of it's their own fault that they, have for one reason or another, maybe have not missed up on opportunities. Then you have other people who are working so hard at they're struggling. And, I always get a kick out of people saying, that they look at people who are poor and say, oh, if they only worked harder. I mean, the people that I covered who were in poverty, so many of them were working harder than anybody I ever met in my life. Many of them were, 2-3 jobs, and it wasn't even just jobs, just trying to deal with the everyday life of getting childcare, transportation, just making ends meet. Where people who $50 a month made all the difference in the world. So it's that, you have to go into it realizing you're covering people, you're covering a very diverse group of people. As I said, the other thing I think that's really important as a journalist is not to just go interview somebody and say, okay, here's a single mother of 2 is about to be evicted, and here's her story. And she represents all these other people who are being evicted. I mean, sometimes you have to do that, obviously, in journalism, because you're on a deadline and you have this story you have to do. To me, the most rewarding stories in the world were where I got to spend days with people. And I honestly, I always found like a big thing would be to meet people in their house, because it just told me so much more about them, because I could see them interacting with the other people in their families. And I guess the other thing that always struck me. I just met, I was a journalist for 47 years. I must admit, I met the most incredible people while I was covering poverty. And some of the most incredible of those incredible people were homeless. And what struck me was there was this extraordinary, sort of talent and skill and human spirit that was being wasted in so many ways by our society. And to me, that's what drove me to keep covering these stories. I was just thinking about, what impact does knowing about epigenetics have, and what would it have if I was, I'm retired now, but if I was covering it. And I think one of the things that it might do, a lot of people who are dealing with poverty are made to feel really bad about themselves. And I think knowing that there's something else going on that they don't necessarily have control over would actually make a lot of them feel like, oh, well, maybe it's not all my fault, I have a challenge. This is another challenge that I have to deal with, but it's not the fact that I'm just a crappy person, which, quite frankly, we as a society make a lot of people, especially homeless people, feel like they are just basically worthless human beings. And that's the great thing about being able to be a journalist and covering poverty is you can tell that story. You can tell the story of who a lot of these people are. And it was really the most rewarding thing that I did in all my journalism.
Thank you, Pam. We have a question in the chat from Brooke McDonald for Dr. Bale. What advice do you have, Dr. Bale, for journalists covering poverty and trauma?
What advice do I have? I mean, it's as a scientist, I often interact at multiple levels, both with journalists and the community, and trying to figure out how to convey the message of the science without it being too overwhelming of a concept. So my advice is to ensure, one, I think as a scientist who studies mental health and having personal experience with family members struggling with mental health, that one of the things that we tend to do is overinterpret or overpromise by saying something is something it's not. And so I think that covering information, especially coming out of science publications, whether it's on humans or animal studies or cells, whatever it is to not try to extrapolate and overpromise to the public that we've now solved autism or schizophrenia or Alzheimer's disease, right? These are things that we often do, and then the public loses trust. And I think on the science side, more engagement can only benefit. I think we've seen, without getting political, thinking of the Trump era, that what happens when we stay too much in our ivory tower and not communicate what's going on is that it distances us and you lose trust with the community and there, for lots of reasons. And so I think opening that dialogue to allow these kinds of conversations we're having today, so we can learn that language matters, so we don't state things, right? The thing that, Anne, you sent us all of these TikToks, my head exploded at watching people, say that some grandpa experienced some train crash and now his granddaughter was afraid of elevators or whatever. I was like, oh, okay, that's just nonsense. But when we make overstatements, people's takeaway and their understanding, I think, can go a little off the track. So my advice would be to make sure that what the information that we're putting out there reflects the interpretation that we can make accurately.
Thank you. And Dr. Carter, I'd like to go to you to kind of continue in that vein a bit. What advice would you have for journalists if they see a study? What are ways that they can tell if this is a legit study, how significant it is? I think especially with, kind of the more social sciences and things of that nature.
one of the things I found in talking to my parents and doing op-eds around the science that I do, but also as a clinical psychologist, has been, it can be really difficult sometimes to parse out what is over-exaggeration of a study finding, or something that we're kind of coupling that we need to consider broad implications. So I will say that is complicated, I think, for a lot of people, is to really understand how to underpin that. But what I will say is a lot of times listening to or talking to the people who did the science can provide a lot of information about where they think is going, because we are trained to really think about our science as like, what does that actually mean? Are we over exaggerating? Is it an effect? Is that something like completely impacting the whole entire world? Usually we're not able to generalize, particularly in the social sciences, to whole groups of people. So when you're saying that, it's probably a red flag to really consider. I also say one of the things that I think is an important consideration that I think Pam and Dr. Bale are pointing out is people who look at people's lives, particularly researchers, from a holistic perspective, right? Particularly in the social sciences, I think gives the most rich data around both not only the deficits that can come or the hardships that can come from poverty, but also the things that have led to strengths and thriving, and how that is an important consideration. So some of the best researchers that I have seen personally have been people who've actually talked to the people that they're doing research with. And as a clinician, also knowing the nuance of the messiness, right? Of I'm not over exaggerating because I know that it could be this and this and this to consider. And this still played out because I considered all of these other factors in my discussion, and I'm elevating what they identified as their strengths, right? So even despite living in this poverty, I have 2 jobs, my kids are doing well, and my kid is about to graduate from high school. I didn't miss that part of the conversation as an important consideration for future research that I'm thinking about. And so people who are able, researchers in particular, who are able to discuss the complexity and the nuance are usually the ones that I have seen who are getting at how messy poverty is and what it means for implications down the road across generations, and are very cognizant not to present a deficit-based lens to people's lived experiences, to be able to present that complexity to their experience.
And Pam, we have a question for you in the Q&A from Juliet Beverly. She asks, what approaches did you use in your reporting about poverty to make sure listeners and readers understand structural racism is at the fault rather than the community?
I guess I'm a little confused about that, because I wouldn't say that it was just, I mean, I think it's everything, you know, it's community, it is structural racism, obviously plays a big role in a lot of people's lives. I think what I tried to do as much as possible, as I say, you know, especially because it was NPR, right? You know, we always tell stories through people. But I would always try and put it with, you know, that what if I did profile a family, or maybe I'd profile several families, right? I would try to put it in as much context as possible. And also, I always tried to present my stories as this is not the definitive story about this issue on evictions, right? This is, I would depict things as this is a slice of what's going on. So I did a whole big series about evictions and housing court. And I just spent weeks in housing court in DC. And I just started talking to all the people who were there. And then I went home with a bunch of them and I followed them along through their process through the court system. But I also talked to the lawyers. I talked to the landlords. You know, I tried to put it within the context, and then also obviously some experts on kind of national, trends and what was going on and what the impact would be. So, you know, I feel like that's sort of the best I could do, right? You know, is just never try and say, this is the definitive story about why people get evicted, right? We are just trying to chronicle events in life and how they are progressing, with the hope, one, of informing our audience, but also two, maybe informing them enough so that we get a better sense of how, again, we as a society address these problems. I hope that answers the question. I'm not sure.
Thank you. And coming back to you, Dr. Carter, do you want to address, I know this is a huge question to ask, but because that question was about structural racism, what do you wish journalists understood about structural racism? And I know, huge question. Take it wherever you want.
With structural racism, one of the things that I think happened after the murder of George Floyd was this big movement, right, around the naming of this injustice and oppression and the structural racisms that keep people behind. I think there was this movement, and I think it's continuing, if people don't know that. But what I like to say is, when we start to name things that weren't named before, sometimes we think things end, right? So, or we think that it's a one-time moment, right? We think that it was just George Floyd, when we know that there was Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, the list goes on. And we can think about historical legacies of oppression that have been going on for a long time. So like, what I like to say when people are talking about structural racism is to not really try hard not to just say it's this one-time point. And it comes in languages that people use around, like, we can end this, without a historical consciousness around how long injustices has happened, from Emmett Till, right, to the killing of Martin Luther King. We can go far and wide around the civil rights movement to now, and we're still having cases to this day. And I think the ways our brains work, we like these little snippets of, like, okay, we had the Black Lives Matter movement. We've had these types of changes. Structural racism is something we're working on. But we also know, as a research scientist, that funding hasn't been supported around studying structural racism for research scientists. We're just recently having calls to study structural racism and its effects. So we haven't really had, as a society, because we can think about racism as a difficult and unpleasant, sometimes for people, conversation to have. And when we think about that, we can think about all the barriers that have came to actually being able to name and process what that means for us as a society, but also to study its effects on marginalized people's lives. We've had limitations in our ability to do that, and to do that effectively. And when you're as a journalist, I would think, like, give people some grace around we are getting funding just to be able to understand this long-standing history, particularly in the US, around this highly multi-level construct, because structural racism isn't disconnected from poverty. They are highly interwoven with each other. But also, we know that the levels of racism, like interpersonal racism, as well as what it means to see someone like you being brutalized by police on a TV screen. We also are studying vicarious racism as a construct. The multiplicity of the stressor of the impact of racism is so multifaceted, and we need more research in that area, that I think giving people grace, as well as understanding how complex that construct is in people's lives that are marginalized, is important consideration, I think, for journalists.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. This is a question that could be for anyone. What do you think, Pam, maybe you want to take a first stab at it, but what do you think journalists can and should do to, even if they are not on the poverty beat, include more socioeconomic diversity among their sources and their coverage areas, kind of regardless of the beat that they're on?
Oh, I think that is amazingly crucial. You know, a lot of work has been done in newsrooms, and many places in recent years, saying, okay, we need to have a more diverse staff. We have to have more diverse reporters. We have to have more diverse editors. Well, one of the things that I've noticed is the diversity in economic background is not really been that much of a factor. It's been much more racial and gender. And while that's important, I do feel like that is a real failing in a lot of newsrooms, that we have not, in fact, had people who who either grew up in poverty or who are still experiencing poverty, quite frankly. One of my proudest moments at NPR was there was a man who was a homeless advocate in Baltimore, and he was great. And I suggested to one of our shows that they have him on and interview him as an expert. And there was a lot of hesitation. They're sort of like, oh, he's homeless. I think they thought he was going to, like start saying crazy stuff, but he was, just really sharp and just so insightful. And I told him, I said, he's a lot sharper and has a lot more to offer than a lot of the lawmakers, that we have on the air. And so anyway, so that's the type of thing, we don't think in newsrooms often to get those voices on. And it's very, very important, as well as making the editorial decisions.
Dr. Bale or Dr. Carter, do you have anything that you'd like to add to that? Or anything, Dr. Bale, that we didn't get to in your
we can talk for the next several days, because there's so many of these topics we just really were touched on. Dr. Carter and I were both at a conference in December, American College of Neuropsychopharmacology, basically a biological psychiatry kind of conference. And one of the things, decades ago in science, and frankly still, gender equity continues to be this issue, right? A representation of women across panels in science and boards and what have you, right? And I think the diversity issue in general has now been sort of put out there as a focus. One of the things that I think that, speaking to how Pam is discussing the inclusion of different diverse groups across the press and what their coverage is, this is also true for the science end of it. It's not just who's on the panel, but the cohort of individuals that you're studying around a given topic needs to be representative as well. And across the United States, that really does not happen. And I think that, just like Pam is saying, for coverage for topics in the press as well as topics in science need to be more diverse as well to ensure that we're inclusive.
That's a really good point. And I wasn't even thinking of that, but of course, you're absolutely right. We are at time, but I did just want to thank, it went quickly. I wanted to thank Dr. Bale, Dr. Carter, and Pam Fessler for joining us today for this great discussion. I hope you all enjoy the beautiful weather here in DC, and take care, and thank you again.